Chris can get set up. In fact, Chris, if you want to start getting set up, you can. Not a problem. So I want to start with some opening remarks. I think it's particularly interesting that I'm up here because I have been with the program since 2014, where I entered as a WISE intern myself. I'm going to really try and get this ringing to stop, but I might just default to just my normal voice. In 2014, and since then I've supported the program because I truly believe that it has the effect that we all want it to have for our young engineers, especially young engineers and scientists. I know that it's traditionally not been scientists, but that's what it says on our website. And I do believe that when it was in 1980, when the program was first started, I do believe that scientists were a big core part of the program, and who knows what the future might hold. So I believe the mission of the WISE program, in case anyone had any questions, it is to bring engineers and scientists together with public policy with a vision that they will stay interested in policy throughout their careers in some way, shape, or fashion. I don't know how to fix it, so.
The moment I got it going, it decided to just restart for whatever reason.
Take your time. I can talk for a while. So the point that they're saying, with the vision of having them return and stay engaged in public policy, and we've had a pretty good success rate over the couple years. I haven't been with the program since its inception, but I can speak to my year and a couple of years since. We've had upwards of 50% of the students come back to work in DC in some capacity. And this year I hope that to be true to some degree as well. Some of the interns have shown interest in coming back and working for some of the exciting fellowships, internships, or government agencies that we've had the pleasure of actually meeting with. So over the summer, we have met with government agencies that have different functions, and that's really the purpose here of okay, there's engineers everywhere involved in everything, so let's meet as many as we can, different ages, different positions, different capacities. We've met with the State Department, right? We've met with the OSTP office, which is the Dwight Eisenhower Executive Office building. We've met with FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Committee. I believe it's FERC. You guys know better than me. NWTRB, so a lot on nuclear. We've done a lot with science and technology policy institutes, like think tanks, FFRDCs. We have definitely met with who else? The Library of Congress. We had the pleasure of going there and having a wonderful time. Interns can maybe speak to you about their experience there. We do that every year, and it's always a highlight because it's a really cool building. We've had past interns come back and we've toured the Capitol building. We've got a little minor tour of the White House, but more of the exterior. But every year we try and instill those experiences in the interns so that they kind of fall in love with maybe having a life here potentially, or at least coming back at some point, meeting their connections. So networking is a huge component of this. And I believe every intern, I'm very proud of everyone here this summer, did a great job. I think you're going to see in today's presentations, they really dug deep. They really know their subject matters, and they're going to talk passionately and confidently, I think, about what they believe to be recommendations for the future. Thank you. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jamison. I'm this year's IEEE contribution to the WISE program. I'm currently a graduate student at Tufts University, where I study semiconductors with an emphasis on photovoltaics. As you can tell by the things, of course, at IEEE and Tufts. Now, today I'd like to talk about a coal to nuclear transition using small modular reactors. Of course, you can tell by the title. And usually when people see coal and nuclear in the same sentence, it gives a bit of anxiety. But I want to show you today why this should actually be a source of our relief. So before I get into this, I'd like to start off with the situation, the complication, and the question. The situation as it stands. We are facing a climate crisis brought on by anthropocentric climate change, use of fossil fuels, emitting the gases that cause the greenhouse effect in our atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, methane, depending on how things melt. We need zero carbon energy, and we need it fast. Now here's the complication. We know this, and we have renewable energy technology available: solar, wind, hydroelectricity. However, solar and wind, they're intermittent. If there's no sunlight or if it's nighttime, you can't get solar generation. If there's no wind blowing, you can't use wind, and hydroelectric capacity is pretty much nearing its full potential use in the continental United States. Furthermore, because of its intermittency, they can provide the base load for essentially our minimum energy needs 24/7, in addition to their intermittency. So my question here is, what can we do to bring about reliable, zero-carbon electricity that will allow us to sustain our use, continue economic growth, without compromising our climate goals and therefore the well-being of this country? Before I get into this, I'd like to start off with the agenda. I hope to give you an explanation of what my proposal is, the background factors that led me to this conclusion, what my recommendations are, what benefits our communities and country at large might see, and some of the challenges involved. Before I get into this, I want to start off with the daily demand cycle, a fundamental concept for understanding the energy grid needs in this country. I've made a little graph here that shows the solar power output and the demand curve, with power being on the vertical axis and time being on the horizontal axis. The same kind of model I use for my own students at Tufts University. Now, I want to point out that, as you can tell, the solar energy generation is not active at all times of the day. And there's also a point in the day where the solar energy curve exceeds the demand on the grid. Now, of course, this is just a generalization of concepts, but this is something we will see play out as we continue the renewable energy transition. And I'll point out that we are going to have risks, because even with adequate energy storage technology, such as batteries or molten salt banks, you're not always going to have enough generation from renewables outside of the peak demand times to essentially meet the demand in these other areas. Furthermore, you'll notice that there's always a minimum point where it never goes any lower on the demand curve, usually occurring during our nighttime hours. Nighttime, we're really not going to get much solar energy. So, my proposal is, in order to maintain our commitment to our climate goals and ensure energy access, we need to have a good source of baseload energy, ideally one that can also be at a variable output to meet demand peaks. So, I want to start off with the main technological crux of my proposals: small modular reactors. Traditionally, nuclear energy deployment in this country has been through large, dedicated reactors, usually in the range of hundreds of megawatts. Small modular reactors, going by small of course, usually have a range around 70 megawatts. Far too small for a large city, but usually nicely sized when you get at least 2 or 3 units for many of our rural communities and moderate-sized towns. First thing I want to start off with, small modular reactors are designed to be meltdown-proof by the physics of their construction. Either, as it says, with most traditional reactors, you need to have an active cooling pump in order to make sure the reactor is cooled. Small modular reactors, while most designs will have active cooling requirements, in the event the pumps are lost, there's no generation of electricity to supply the pumps, whatever reason, they'll still avoid a meltdown, either through natural dissipation in their design or by, in some cases, using an entirely passive cooling loop with whatever cooling, be it water, even helium is one proposal I've heard. Being modular, you can swap these on and off site. Now, it's not exactly going to be the easiest thing. You'll have to consider local infrastructure and such. But it does open up the possibility that when it comes to fueling, you can have freshly fueled reactors installed on site that were fueled and maintained at a facility off site. This can help alleviate some of the needs and concerns a rural community might have about the presence of fuels nearby, which is very much justified and understandable. Furthermore, as I said earlier, you'll have an easier time matching local energy needs or needs in the microgrid if that gets developed with a small modular reactor than a traditional large-scale reactor, which also means it'll be cheaper to build and cheaper to set up. And finally, the economy of standards. Small modular reactors will be intended to have wide-scale deployment, long production times. This means we're going to have a core of professionals and technicians who know how to work with these reactors. Say a cold nuclear plant in the southeast has need for a new technician. Well, they can make a hiring, and someone who's operating the same model SMR at, say, a manufacturing plant up in the Pacific Northwest could have the same qualifications, can come down and help support the endeavors at this plant. Now, when it comes to the coal power plant site, this is where these would be situated, with the assumption that most of these coal plants have either been decommissioned or on their way to being decommissioned. I'm going to say this because in most cases, the coal plant would remain derelict otherwise. Just like any power plant, they're going to have an exclusion zone, but typically issues with coal ash and other combustion residuals would render them unsuitable for further uses. By allowing the use of small modular reactors on these sites, it breathed new life into these plants. The exclusion zone's already been set up, which handles that need when it comes to any power plant. There's already supporting infrastructure, roads, buildings, substations nearby, and resource use, such as the water you need for the actual turbines to get this electricity out into the grid itself. Permits will already have existed at the state and local level that can either be renewed, expanded on, or, going by some of my recommendations, expedited. And furthermore, this can continue to be a source of tax revenue, employment, and development for the nearby community. This is a relatively important point because when these plants are shut down, that's it. That's end of story for most cases. This is a proposal to bring new life to them. I want to highlight the specific benefits of the coal to nuclear transition for the community itself. As I stated earlier, a source of tax revenue development, further construction for any new buildings, bring temporary jobs, resource developments to support the plant can still be used for the rest of the community at large. I want to bring a specific point to the high-paying permanent jobs. DOE estimates bring that a small modular reactor plant can have as many as 4 times as many permanent, higher-paying jobs than the previously operating coal plant. Now, a job itself is a good thing. We have to consider these professionals and technicians, once they arrive, they need housing, they need groceries, they need car insurance. This will spur spending and economic development in local communities that can help give them another lifeline. And ultimately, I want to highlight the fact that a coal to nuclear transition is a clean energy pathway that specifically will be more beneficial for rural communities. Oftentimes, proposals such as rooftop solar, which I'm quite familiar with, or electric vehicle charging stations are predominantly going to be targeted towards urban and suburban residents. Not that their needs don't need to be addressed, of course, but a coal to nuclear transition using these plants will be more adaptable and more suited for the needs of rural residents and ensure that they're not left behind in the green energy transition. Now, I have 2 sets of recommendations to fulfill these goals, split up by federal and state and local implementation. At the federal level, a lot of this authority is going to be coming under the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I'd advise the NRC to accept state and local requirements in the early site permit, which determines where a nuclear reactor may be sited. We have 50 plus state governments, territories. All of them have their own city and county governments. They're all going to have their own requirements for permitting and such, since non-nuclear plants for energy are handled at the local level. If there's a program set up within the NCR, or at least just a pathway for standard substitution, it can help expedite the deployment of a coal to nuclear transition. The NRC should furthermore give priority to the early site permit reviews for any coal to nuclear project, further bring down the timeline, and additionally signal support for this endeavor. And finally, the Title 10 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Parts 50 and 52, which primarily manage nuclear energy, need reform from the NRC. I specifically want to bring attention to the manufacturing license. Small modular reactors being designed for years-long, large-scale manufacturing. There's currently a 3-year lockout before the license ends in which no reactor can be manufactured. If you're trying to produce these things at scale to bring costs down, that's not viable, and that should be amended. And furthermore, in general, these codes of federal regulations do need to have some revisions to be more suited for nuclear reactor, small modular reactor use. At the state and local level, I advise state and local authorities to exempt storage and renewable energy project permitting for the early site permits. As I said, if you have an exclusion zone for a power plant, there's going to be no habitation there. The safety improvements with a small modular reactor mean you really have fewer risks. And even then, the requirements of an early site permit are very vigorous and appropriately vigorous. So I would say citing battery storage plants or even molten salt tanks will allow these new nuclear plants to not just be power plants in their own right, but possibly the nexus for local energy grids, providing resiliency through stored energy. State and local authorities should waive permitting for any upgrades to the infrastructure. What really comes to mind is the transmission infrastructure, which this country is going to need at large. With the larger energy output of a nuclear plant, transmission infrastructure will need to be upgraded. To facilitate the success of this project, I highly advise waiving of these permits, especially for stuff that's already been built. Finally, I believe that they need to raise public awareness of the benefits of a coal to nuclear project and its full implications for the community. And when I say raise public awareness, I don't mean bringing in a group of talking heads to just talk at these people. Our communities have a wide range of NGOs, state colleges, community colleges, who can enlist students to help raise awareness to their own family members, members of the community, Furthermore, this might be a pathway to get some of these people involved in the transition, give them opportunities beyond what their own school programs would currently afford. One thing I want to highlight, cooperation between federal, state, local, and non-governmental organizations will be key to this success. If such cooperation is fulfilled, however, this could be a new phase for American energy development and really for these communities themselves. I want to highlight some of the challenges that this endeavor will face. First off, small modular reactor uniqueness. Every design is going to be different. While most designs are going to be focusing on water cooling, some, as I said earlier, helium, molten salt perhaps, each reactor will have its own set of requirements, and although we're going to have economies of standards, it'll take some time to fully realize these, especially in the early deployment phases. Transmission capacity is a requirement for any energy development. We're going to need more transmission infrastructure no matter what, regardless of a C2N. However, there's still going to be a relatively acute need at the local level for these projects. NIMBYism is the bane of all energy development in this country, period. That will need to be addressed. Hopefully, an adequate public awareness program can alleviate that, but it will remain persistent and should not be discounted. Site viability. Although the DOE has determined hundreds of sites, in fact, that are still viable, updating requirements such as climate and geological resiliency for the early site permit may rule out some of these sites, if not for the fact that they have been decommissioned for so long they might be non-viable otherwise. Copper theft comes to mind. Finally, fueling is tightly regulated by the NRC and NWTRB. Depending on reactor design, fueling may not be able to be handled fully off-site, which will introduce additional licenses and complexities in the process of getting this established. However, none of these challenges are insurmountable, and with adequate preparation and commitment on behalf of all those involved, they can be handled and they won't be as great a barrier to success of this endeavor. Sources for images are provided. The full sources for the information in this content will be available in my final paper. Are there any questions? Please.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm curious how you would work through the fact that if you wanted to waive permitting availability, but also need to ensure that the site is viable, and you're discussing the need for ensuring that the right permit is there. How do those two come together?
So I'm being asked about how we would ensure site viability and permit requirements. A very good question. That level is primarily going to be handled at state and local authorities. And I said, that was not really in the scope of this project because of the wide range of requirements. However, on assuming the establishment of a successful program for substituting state and local requirements in the early site permit application, the engineering work should really be able to be handled at the local level by the utility or the construction firms. Really, when it comes adopting the standards of future early site permits is going to be one of those processes that really necessitates communication that's very clear between the NRC and state and local authorities. So I have to say, the nexus, really the impetus is going to be on state and local authorities, but it will be an NRC process because it comes down really to the early site permit. So I would say that a coal to nuclear transition is a project, or it's a process that's groundbreaking. We're going to trip over more hassles than what I've been able to explain so far as this gets underway. And this question addresses some of the things we're going to find out more about upon the implementation of this. Very good question, thank you. Hello.
When you said using the footprint of coal facilities, the entire footprint, do you see having to meet all the same infrastructure? Or do you see this being maybe a site that will have small modular nuclear as well as other renewables on the same site?
That's a very good question, something I hope my recommendations will address. So I'm being asked if this will require the same footprint of the site for a small modular reactor and the renewables. So with engineering estimates by the NRC for the new scale reactor, which is the only design license certified and SMR, they expect that you can actually reduce the necessary exclusion zone because of the safety improvements. So the footprint theoretically for an SMR plant can be smaller. However, coal plants have already been established, the exclusion zone has already been established. I think it would be viable to really, it should be no larger than the footprint of the coal plant itself, especially if you got storage and other renewable facilities within the exclusion zone built. If you want to reduce that footprint, that's something more viable for new builds. But depending on how coal ash and combustion residuals have been treated or decontaminated, you might be able to reduce it for any viable project if that becomes a concern.
Has this ever been done before?
There's, I believe in Montana, there's currently proposals for a project to go through this. It actually has the support of the state government, but it's very much in its early phases. And I would like to add personal commentary. For a larger scale implementation of this, we are waiting on more available small modular reactor designs. But Montana is interested, and I think many utilities, especially in the Midwest and the Southeast, are going to be interested in this. But we have to wait for technology availability and really assuaging public fears and concerns. Any further questions? Okay.
So NIMBYism by its very, I'm Alan from the science group. NIMBYism by its very nature has a political constituency, because it's local, politicians really respond to NIMBYs. So how are you considering the political environment and trying to get these ideas across when the constituents of the area might be fighting this?
Very good question. How we're going to deal with NIMBYism? Well, I would say really every locality is going to have its own concerns. Now, houses are the main store of value for most American citizens, so addressing the economic element is going to be common, but you really have to look at the local concerns specifically, because depending on especially demographic makeup, a person's concerns and maintaining the value of their house might not just be purely financial, it might be cultural or even social. But this is why I really emphasize the need for local organizations to be involved in the public messaging process. We cannot create a top-down public awareness campaign. It's not viable for a plan that is so reliant on local needs. But very good question, and this is something that will need further attention as a C2N is implemented.
How would you address any misinformation or disinformation that will probably come either domestically or from the international community or countries that might think that we're putting in place nuclear facilities all over as a hidden nuclear program?
Addressing the threats of misinformation domestic.
Any misinformation or disinformation that these are all just little miniature facilities that we're, storing things.
Okay, that's fair. So, depending on design, if these facilities don't work, when it comes, the management of the fuel itself is outside the purview. I'm specifically focused on the modular reactors themselves, but in the case where you won't need to store on site, that's something that should really be emphasized in the messaging, in addition to the safety enhancements of the reactor itself. Give the people the facts. However, when it comes to managing misinformation, disinformation at large, both within the community and potentially from international interests using the internet and such, that would be something really outside the domain of the project managers, and I would hope that developments in cybersecurity and such might be able to mitigate this in the future.
How much rehabilitation do the former coal plant sites need to be transitioned to capable for SMRs?
Very good question. And that's going to depend really on the site itself. That's primarily an engineering challenge. As it stands, depending on the level of combustion residual contamination, these sites might be temporarily locked up by the EPA for getting this cleaned up if the primary operator is not in compliance, which is going to be a major consideration. Beyond that, as I mentioned, copper theft, depending on how long it's been decommissioned, it may take extensive engineering work. You might not just be replacing upgrading transfers. You might have to replace it entirely. If you're going to be drawing water from a river for cooling, you might need new permits. So it really comes down, it also comes down to how many reactors you're going to house on site. Most estimates are going to be 3 to 4. Some communities might be able to get away with 1 or 2, and some you might need even more for whatever reason. Now, the footprint of the reactor building itself is going to be substantially smaller, especially compared to a coal furnace, which can be multiple stories tall. But that's really a question for the engineering firms. But addressing these concerns, such as the involvement of the EPA and still the extensive construction requirements on site, especially local road infrastructure, is a very important thing that will limit construction activities. And it's good to keep in mind for further implementation. Any further questions? Thank you for your curious people. It's a pleasure to present this to you.
junior at Boise State University studying material science and engineering, and I'm sponsored by the American Nuclear Society. I stand here before you today to present on establishing a domestic HALEU supply chain. HALEU stands for High Assay Low Enriched Uranium, and it's the fuel required to power our nation's future advanced nuclear reactor fleet. An issue plaguing the United States today is that we currently lack enrichment capabilities for HALEU, which will cause delays in rolling out advanced nuclear reactors. Today, I will provide 3 policy recommendations. First, passing the Nuclear Fuel Security Act, then establishing a uranium bank, and finally, downblending stockpiles of high-enriched uranium fuel owned by the Department of Energy. First, let's start with discussing the nuclear energy capabilities of the United States today. Then we'll look at the timeline and demand projections for HALEU, before then performing a market analysis on what exactly Congress and DOE needs to do to regulate our HALEU needs, before finally rolling out 3 policy recommendations. First, let's take a look at the nuclear industry in the U.S. Nuclear does many things for Americans today. It's powerful, reliable, and clean. Starting with powerful, nuclear energy provides almost 20% of total electricity generated in the United States. It's not just that. It brings over 50% of our carbon-free electricity. Nuclear is the most reliable energy source, providing reliable baseload power to millions of Americans. The term capacity factor is the ratio of electrical energy produced over time compared to what could have been produced at full operating power. For nuclear, that number is 93.5%, higher than coal, natural gas, wind, solar, and hydropower. Finally, nuclear is clean. It provides 500 million metric tons, or prevents that amount of metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year. We need nuclear. Let's take a look at the differences between the existing and the advanced nuclear fleet. The existing fleet is currently composed of 93 light water reactors. Light water meaning it uses normal water as a moderator and a coolant. Nuclear reactors are in 28 states, and it uses low-enriched uranium fuel. It's fitting that we pause here and take a deeper dive into how uranium enrichment is described. Uranium-235 is the main fissile isotope used to sustain a nuclear chain reaction, but it only exists in nature in less than 1% of uranium rock. The other 99% is uranium-238. Uranium must go through a series of chemical processing steps to enrich it to the desired levels of U-235 to be fit in nuclear reactors. For the current fleet, 3 to 5% U-235 is the enrichment range. Up to 20% U-235 is what constitutes low-enriched uranium. High-assay low-enriched uranium is considered a higher concentration of low enrichment between 5 to 20%. Which brings us to the advanced nuclear reactor fleet. Scientists are rolling out a new generation of advanced reactors which span a wide array of designs, but all of which plan to be an improved form of reactor, bringing better safety, decreased waste, and more fuel efficiency. Most advanced reactor designs require HALEU. Next, let's take a look at the HALEU supply chain as it stands in the U.S. today. In order to do so, we must look at that series of steps I previously alluded to of the uranium supply chain. First is mining. As I mentioned, natural uranium is found at less than 1% enrichment. Uranium is mined all over the world through conventional mining or in situ leaching. Mills are typically co-located with mines. The milling is the stage where uranium ore is turned into a concentrated form known as yellow cake. After that, enrichment occurs. The most common enrichment method is the gas centrifuge process. This increases the U-235 concentration to the desired levels for which type of reactor it plans to be used in. Next is deconversion. This is used to produce stable compounds of both enriched and depleted uranium. Deconverted enriched uranium turns into a metal or an oxide form, and deconverted depleted uranium is stored at sites near the deconversion facility as a waste product. Next, fabrication. Fuel pellets are pressed, sintered, and loaded into fuel assemblies, which are placed into the reactor. So now that we have a better understanding of the uranium supply chain, let's focus our attention on enrichment. Russia is the only nation that has commercial enrichment capabilities to produce HALEU currently. It's not just HALEU. Russia has been flooding American markets with subsidized uranium since the 1990s. However, because they are the only nation with the ability to produce HALEU at a scale large enough to fuel a fleet of advanced reactors, this has made many nuclear professionals wary of relying on one source, particularly with the current events these days with Russia as a foreign adversary. Let's now focus on what the United States does have in terms of enrichment capability. The company Centrus was recently awarded a Department of Energy contract to produce small quantities of HALEU. This was a demonstration contract in order to demonstrate that their technology worked. However, it will not produce enough HALEU to be considered a commercial scale enrichment facility. However, it shows promise. Urenco is a company in New Mexico, the only commercial scale enrichment facility in the US, but it only produces the lower enriched uranium in the 3 to 5% category for the current reactor fleet. So now that we are aware that we only have demonstration capabilities for HALEU production, let's take a look at a market analysis to see just how far we would be able, hypothetically, to stretch that capability and what we need to take our HALEU production to a commercialized scale. This conundrum has been called the chicken or the egg scenario of HALEU. I would like to focus on enrichment versus reactors in terms of supply and demand. So as you see here, we see Centrus and Urenco as the two potential enrichment capabilities in the United States, the potential suppliers of HALEU. We also have two demonstration reactor companies, TerraPower and X-Energy, which plan to be the first two advanced reactors in the United States to be operational within the decade. This represents the demand side. Currently, our situation is that there are no advanced reactors operational in the United States. Although we have two planned within the decade, this will only create two long-term purchase agreements. According to a report by the Idaho National Laboratory, this demand, although it would create indeed some demand for HALEU, is not strong enough to fuel these supply enrichment companies with enough financial incentive to undertake the vast capital investment required to produce gas centrifuge cascades to produce HALEU. Therefore, what we've seen is that the market for HALEU has been extremely stagnant, and really neither side has budged to make progress on the issue. Through my findings on this research, I've found that what the nation needs is the government to stimulate the market for HALEU by being the first buyer. This will feed into a policy recommendation to create a uranium bank. So let's just get right into that. My first recommendation is passing the Nuclear Fuel Security Act. This has been considered in both the House and the Senate, and a similar version of it was passed in the Senate at the very end of the last Congress. However, the Nuclear Security Act must be reevaluated in the 118th Congress because it'll give much broader legislative authority to the Secretary of Energy than they currently have. Next. The Nuclear Fuel Security Act was pushed forward by Senator John Barrasso, and although it does many things for the nuclear industry in general, such as banning all Russian uranium imports for LEU, I'd like to focus our attention on the main HALEU provision in the bill, the HALEU for Advanced Nuclear Reactors Demonstration Program projects. This portion is extremely important because it authorizes the Secretary to stockpiles of uranium to be considered for our advanced reactors. It also prioritizes the demonstration reactors TerraPower and X-Energy to be the priority recipients of them. So Congress should expeditiously work toward getting the Nuclear Fuel Security Act passed because it will give much broader authority to the Secretary. However, even if that does not happen, DOE has an existing framework by which they're already authorized under the Energy Act of 2020 to execute a HALEU bank. The model for this is as such. First, DOE would award cost-shared public-private partnerships to uranium enrichment and deconversion companies. There has already been a draft request for proposals out in which DOE has began to solicit these companies to undertake these partnerships. This would reduce the risk of investment since both the government and the private sector are putting their funds together. The second step in the process is offtake agreements. The Department of Energy would be the first buyer and owner of all HALEU produced by enrichment and deconversion companies. In fact, the Nuclear Energy Institute recommended in a report that DOE buy 10 metric tons of HALEU per supplier per year in order to sustain a fleet of advanced reactors. By making the Department of Energy the first buyer, this will stimulate the market by providing enrichment companies with the confidence that there will be a market to sell the fuel they produce, thus remedying the supply and demand stagnation that I previously covered under the market analysis section. And finally, DOE would then sell the fuel in its uranium bank to advanced reactor companies. They could essentially subscribe to fuel purchases. There's limited risk associated with the DOE being a stakeholder in this process since they would make back the money they sell it to. And even if advanced reactor companies do not follow up and make subsequent purchases after the first buy, DOE could sell that fuel to test reactors, or they could merely self-extinguish once the bank no longer serves its purpose and the private market forces take over eventually, and optimistically they will do so. Finally, it's important that we cover our bases and look toward a very near-term solution for providing HALEU to advanced reactor demonstrations, the two of which require fuel loadings within the next several years to be operational by 2030. One method is uranium recovery and downblending. So recovery is when we can reprocess spent high-enriched uranium fuel, spent referring to fuel which has been previously irradiated within a reactor, to recover the uranium. We can then downblend, meaning mix it with lower enriched uranium fuel, to create HALEU at any desired enrichment level. Efforts for downblending are already taking place at the Idaho National Laboratory, and they have been for 20 years. The Secretary of Energy should direct and prioritize downblended fuel to go specifically to the two advanced demonstration reactors in order to have fuel by the timelines required. So, in review, we first looked at the nuclear energy industry and saw how we are transitioning from an existing to an advanced nuclear fleet. Secondly, we looked at projections for our HALEU demands and the timeline required. We then assessed the market to see that the fuel market will not fit itself without government intervention. And then finally recommended 3 policies to stimulate a strong HALEU market: passing the Nuclear Fuel Security Act, establishing a uranium bank, and then finally downblending HEU stockpiles. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Are there any questions? Yes.
Based on the current stockpile that we've got our access to uranium, how long do you see this approach taking care of our energy needs?
Well, I know
Or
that
do you see having to import? I know that you talked about increasing Russian import. How about?
I think that if the Department of Energy were to award a contract to centrist and provide them with enough upfront capital to commercialize their enrichment capabilities. Our next two reactors, TerraPower and X-Energy, would have enough fuel to get up and running, but I think that the DOE would eventually need to expand its capabilities to, for example, Urenco. But I think that between those two suppliers, that we would be able to run on HALEU for the foreseeable future. Does that answer your question? Oh, you also mentioned the importation. So the United States would like to source uranium preferably from our own soil, but they're also looking to anywhere in North America, and that comes directly from those requests for proposals where they specify that we no longer want to be importing fuel from that far over the globe for HALEU because we want to have a really reliable source of it. So we've already taken actions to kind of source it domestically. So I don't see us going in the direction of getting HALEU enriched from nations that aren't Canada or the United States. Yes.
So out of the two advanced reactors that you're proposing funding, how much energy do they produce, and how much energy they produce relative to the needs of America?
So TerraPower is a 345 megawatt electric advanced reactor. X-Energy are 4 modular reactors, each producing 80 megawatt electric. And I believe it's something on the order of 772 billion megawatt electric is what all of nuclear produced in maybe 2020, 2021. But I don't know the energy demands of the United States. I can get back to you on that though. Yes.
If all goes optimistically as you expect, we would have a good stockpile of HALEU. Would the United States have the ability through the Nuclear Fuel Security Act to then export HALEU and become a competitor on the international stage to Russia and export to countries like France that use nuclear power?
Yes. So although initially the Nuclear Fuel Security Act would like to direct fuel to our advanced reactor demonstrations, once that quantity is satisfied and we have a stable ability to fuel those 2 reactors and additional advanced reactors, the bill does give jurisdiction to export that, so we can be a profitable exporter of HALEU.
How do you see widening this market beyond those 2 companies or the 4 that you put up? Because if the government's buying all of the energy and then sending it back, from a market standpoint, there's not much of competition. Do you see expansion in the future or other?
I do. Although in this presentation I've only highlighted 2 examples of advanced reactors, the program under which those 2 are being facilitated actually involves 8 additional advanced reactors, each staggered by 5 years or so. So these are just the first 2 in the program. But even among those 10 total under the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, that's just merely DOE giving money to those reactors to demonstrate some concepts and get the ball rolling for advanced nuclear. I believe that once all 10 of those are demonstrated, it'll be such a proven, technology and profitability point that there will be a lot more advanced reactors going operational on their own terms, aside from government funding. So I think there will be a much larger market as we get into the 2030s and 2040s. Yes.
How big do you think the market has to get before the DOE doesn't have to participate in the buying of fuel?
That's a good question. I guess I would say once either fuel fabricators or the reactor utilities themselves could buy it for cheaper from a competing source of uranium. So for example, the DOE buys it at market value and then sells it to the reactor or to the fuel fabricator. But the minute that there's any sort of competition in the sense, the government under the Nuclear Fuel Security Act, is not authorized to compete economically. So I think at the point where you can sell it for cheaper because there's that abundance of HALEU, that there would no longer be a need for the bank, and it could go ahead and self-extinguish. But I guess I don't know how to put that into a quantity of how many metric tons of HALEU would need to be in our economy for that to happen.
Or a number of reactors.
Yeah, I would say the INL report that I referenced earlier said more than several, but that's, so there's demonstration reactors. It said more than several commercial. So I would say like a good 5. Yeah. Yes.
Are there estimates for what it would cost for the government to get this program up and running and then needing to maintain the energy bank?
Yes, the Nuclear Energy Institute recommended that the government fund it at $200 million per year. And I talked to somebody who works in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and he believes $2.5 billion is the funding level. However, the Inflation Reduction Act gave $700 million to HALEU, so we would be able to subtract that in any sort of mass spending bill from that $2.5 billion. All right, thank you, everybody. So, hello, my name is Abbey Hageman. I'm a rising senior in materials science at the University of Nevada in Reno. I'm sponsored to be here by the American Nuclear Society. Thank you so much, those are the people who are present. And like everyone else presenting today, I'm part of the WISE program. My topic for this summer is about closing the nuclear fuel cycle through nuclear waste recycling. So, quick little overview of this presentation. First, I'm going to go through an introduction and try and give you a little bit of background, since Sarah and Chris have both done some background into how the nuclear process works. I'll try and skip that. Then I'll give the options I think the United States has in terms of what to do with our used nuclear waste. Next, I'll go over the challenges of each thing that the U.S. can do, and why maybe we should or shouldn't do them. Finally, I'll give my recommendation for I think what we should work toward, and then actions for how we can work towards that recommendation, or that end goal, shall we say. And then after that, I'll take questions. So, quick little introduction. A nuclear fuel pellet is it's about this big. These are very energy dense pellets. So, as you can see on my little figure up here, one uranium pellet can be equal to 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas, 120 gallons of oil, or a ton of coal. And I mean ton scientifically, not as colloquial term. Now, when we use these pellets in reactors, we actually don't extract all of the energy that we could from them. A number that's thrown out a lot is 10%. They say if we put this in a nuclear reactor, once pull it out and then store it, we use about 10% of the energy that we could. Now, as I talked with Alan over the process, that's assuming we could extract 100%. Now, because we don't have perfect technology, that's not quite true, so it's a little bit of a discrepancy. But we're going to use 10% for now. Now, the other thing here, what we do in the United States, we take our fuel, we put it through our reactor, we pull it out, and we store it. This is starting to be a little bit of an issue in the nuclear community because we have no permanent storage site. So all of our UNF is just kind of settling around at utility sites. It's starting to take up all of the space they have, and people are getting a little grouchy about that. So what I'm going to go into is about recycling, right? Like with plastics, we don't want to use something once and then throw it away. We want to take as much out of it as we can so we're not wasting things. But our big issue here in policy that I went over this summer is most of the nuclear community cannot implement any kind of recycling because we don't have the regulations to be licensed for recycling. So let me go over a little timeline here. We have in the past been able to have commercial recycling facilities, but it's kind of gone back and forth with public view, with presidency. So I'm going to just go through this timeline real quick. After all of the fun little Oppenheimer things, or not so fun Oppenheimer things really, President Eisenhower wanted to endorse using nuclear technologies for energy, his Atoms for Peace speech, very famous. With using nuclear for energy came the possibility of recycling the fuel. So, after all of our not so fun Oppenheimer things, we had the Atomic Energy Committee, which allowed nuclear recycling from civil companies if they were licensed. This went on for a little while. We had some companies actually got their facilities up and running. In a couple cases, they were pretty good until 1977 when President Carter implemented a ban on nuclear recycling. But others of them actually started functioning and then had to shut down for various issues. One was tested as a pilot plant and it worked well, but then later when they tried to do it commercially, it just didn't stand up to the task. Another one actually started functioning and then the regulations changed. And they were told, you need to make all of these modifications because you're not safe enough, essentially. So they went, overviewed, went, okay, all of these modifications will take this much money. This isn't economically feasible anymore. We're just going to shut down. Next, we had President Reagan come in. He lifted the ban Carter put on. There were some options for companies to go back, right? So they had started this facility up to recycle the fuel, stopped because of the ban, and then came back and went, okay, we're allowed to do this again. Is it worth it? Is it economic for my company to start recycling used nuclear fuel again? And basically, the answer has been no. So until now, not many people have really looked into recycling, not just because there's no policy, but because it's not economically feasible. And without those regulations, it becomes even more of a challenge. I'll go into that in a little bit later. I'm going to finish my timeline first, though. Now, also in 1982, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was passed. I'm not just going to talk about recycling here, I'm going to talk about storage a little bit, because in my mind, recycling is actually our solution to our storage issue. In the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, the government asked all of the utility companies with nuclear plants to pay them per megawatt hour into this thing called the Nuclear Waste Fund. They asked these companies to do this, saying, if you pay us this, at the end of your reactor, or at the end of your fuel cycle, once you pull your fuel out and it's cooled down, and you've put it in your transportation casks, we will take that off your hands, and we will store it for you. We'll take title to that used nuclear fuel, and we'll store it. And this also designated what many experts around the world have said is the best option for storing that waste, which is to put it in what's called a deep geologic repository. So, in this policy act, they also said, we want to find a repository, we're going to start characterization. Come 1987, they found 3 locations to characterize, and have decided on one of them. It's called Yucca Mountain. Some of you may or may not have heard about it. In 1987, with this amendment, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act said, we're going to use Yucca Mountain. And until Yucca Mountain is characterized and constructed, the government, the Department of Energy, will not be allowed to go and characterize another site for a repository or interim storage site. So right now, we're actually stuck with this. Yucca Mountain has not happened because the people of Nevada don't really want it to. They see it as the rest of the country calling their state a wasteland. They go, we don't use nuclear energy, why should we store the rest of the company's waste from it? So it was stalled, it was defunded after kind of a long, tumultuous history through policy. And that is part of the reason we don't have a repository today. So going back to recycling a little bit in this timeline, it's kind of fluctuated per presidency. We've had presidents who are for it, we've had presidents against it, and it hasn't happened because it goes back and forth every 4 years. Kind of hard to make any progress when that happens. So I'm going to go over what we do right now. In the United States, we do what is called a once-through fuel cycle, which is also called an open fuel cycle. And in this case, we make our fuel, we put it through a reactor, we pull it out, we store it in this spent fuel pool, that's the big orange and blue thing, for about 5 years to cool down. After that, it's put into dry cask storage. This picture at the bottom with all of these large gray things and the telephone pole, I'm gonna give a reference there. That little half-length fence is probably about this tall. So these casks are probably 2.5 of me in height, and not small enough for me to hug. And these are what are filling up utility companies' land everywhere because the Nuclear Waste Policy Act has not been able to be enacted. So another option is single pass recycling. This helps a little bit. Any recycling decreases the amount of end-life, high-level waste that would need to go into storage. The number for multi-recycling is about 20%. So instead of these giant casks, imagine after your multi-recycle, you want about 20% of the size of it. So about a fifth of the size, right? And then you go, okay, not only do we get much more energy, but now we have less storage, or less waste to store, rather. So why don't we do it? Apart from economics and policy, what's the issue? Why is policy an issue here? A big one is proliferation. As with any kind of separation of nuclear materials, you go, okay, there's the possibility of plutonium being pulled out, therefore we need to worry about proliferation. In those past recycling for the facilities, we use something called the Purex process, which is where plutonium and uranium were both separated out. This is a process that we know how to do. It's a process we've done before. It's the only one we've done before on a commercial level, which is part of why recycling is so difficult today, because the Purex process is not well liked because of its proliferation issues. So if we want to go into recycling in the future, we need to use a different process, which means we're moving into uncertain territory. Another one, of course, is regulation. For the companies who are looking into recycling right now, when they go through and try and get their licensing, they've been, as it was put to me, writing their way around gaps. So when they go and they put in their licensing application, they actually have to specify exactly how they're going around this gap that hasn't been filled in regulation. That means more time, which means more money. It also means more uncertainty in this already very uncertain process. Lastly, and you'll notice this one coming up a lot, again, we have no existing permanent disposal spot. This is another thing I like about recycling that I'll get into on the next slide because it's more important for multi-recycling. And of course, your process for single pass. If you haven't gathered from the name, you would use it once, you would separate it out, refabricate it into fuel, and then reuse that fuel one time before putting it into disposal instead of what we do with our plastics, where we continuously recycle until we can't anymore. And that's my next slide, is multi-recycling. In multi-recycling, it's basically the same process, except you keep going. You keep going until there's too much of the fuel made up from minor actinides or U-236 instead of, like Sarah was talking about, our fuel is made of uranium-238 and 235. 236 is kind of a byproduct, and it just builds up, and in separation processes, they're usually chemical, so we can't separate the isotopes without extra work, which means extra money. Catching on to a theme here. So, again, typical process, use it, cool it, refabricate it, reuse it, recool it, refabricate it, continue until you can't anymore. Same challenges, proliferation, regulation, no existing repository. With the added bit of it's more expensive because you may have more processes and you may have more things to deal with when you go over this multiple times. You have to pay more attention to where each portion and each separation is going and where it's coming from. So you have higher security that you have to worry about as well. It's also untested. If we're not using the PRX process, then we have to find a new process. Has anybody invested in anything they know nothing about that's never been tried before? A little bit scary, not just for you, but for the nuclear companies. Lastly, multi-recycling creates much more low-level waste. Now, while high-level waste is the bigger storage issue we have, low-level waste can also be an issue. We don't really have the infrastructure to deal with that much waste. So why would we do this again? I'm forgetting myself at this point. Like, talked about all the cons, right? What are our pros again? Well, 10% energy, right? Does anybody know how much of the United States is run by fossil fuels still?
A lot.
Audience engagement?
A lot.
79%. Yeah, over 80%.
80%, 79%. I'm gonna go with Chris's feels best. He was doing all the renewable stuff. I don't have the exact number in my mind, but it's pretty high. So if at 10% of our possible extracted energy from this, imagine what we could do with 100%. We won't get to 100%, but maybe we could get to 80%, right? Lots more green, clean energy. And if we're recycling it, the big thing nobody likes, the radioactive waste that's in your backyard, is decreasing. And it's easier to store. In multi-recycling, I also wanted to talk about something called transmutation. So, why does it take so long for radioactive waste to become safe again? Part of this is because long-lived fission products, which means they have a long half-life, and minor actinides that have long half-lives. It means over a long period of time, they release little doses of radioactivity. By transmuting some of these things, you can make them into shorter-lived products. If you make it into that, yes, they release radioactivity still, but if their half-lives are shorter, they're gonna basically release it faster, right? So instead of needing a repository for 1 billion years to store this waste, maybe you only need it for 100 million, maybe even less. I'm not actually a nuclear engineer, so I'm not gonna give you those scientific points. But that would make it easier to make a repository. Instead of having to characterize a site that's going to last forever, now you just have to characterize a site that's going to last a long time. Another big point there is for the permanent storage we want right now, notice how I say permanent storage, not disposal. You don't want to go and dispose something that you can still possibly use in the future, we're still evolving. Our technology can get better. If we do a once-through cycle and we want to store our waste, we want to be able to retrieve it later so that we can use it. If we use all of the possible energy and useful things from that waste, we don't need to worry about that. We can go put it in a hole in the ground. Again, easier to characterize. So, challenges with all of them. Repository, necessary. I think multi-recycling will make this easier to solve, right? If you use all of the useful things, you don't need to go retrieve it, and if you make it shorter lived, then it's not as difficult to find a resting spot. Public perception. Why didn't Yucca Mountain happen? Because they didn't want it to, because they find radioactive waste scary, which radioactive waste is scary, and part of that is a public thing, part of it is not. Those the big casks I showed you, people walk up next to those without any sort of radiation protection every day, because they are protected by the radiation already. This is science we understand, not as individual humans and citizens of the United States, but in general. We have scientists who understand it. If we educate the public so that they also understand it, it becomes a much less scary thing. It's like when you're a 2-year-old, you see a daddy long leg in your bathtub, and you go, that's a spider, it can bite me, it's scary. Well, you grow up to be a 10-year-old and your parents say, no, you don't understand, it can't hurt you. It physically cannot hurt you, its mouth is too small. To me, this is the same kind of thing. If we educate you, if we let you know exactly what's happening, then you don't have to be scared anymore, it's not an unknown. The other one is licensing. If we don't have licensing regulations, then companies are not going to want to expend the extra money and time to go around these regulations. And we need that for both the chemical separation processes and the recycling process. Finally, economics. How do we make the economics easier? Well, there are a lot of answers to that. The easy one is money, right? The easy one is walk up and say, well, government, can you please, please, please give us money so that we can do this? And the government will probably say no because everybody's asking that. So how do we fix economics? Well, advanced reactors might help. Oklo is a company that's rolling out a molten salt reactor, and they hope to do some reprocessing and recycling in their reactor. And they're one of those companies I was talking about. They're working around the gaps. They're willing to put in the expense, so maybe they'll make a breakthrough. But other companies won't be able to do that. So if we put money into regulation now and we make it more feasible for everybody, maybe more people will go through. My recommendation for now is to continue with the once-through fuel cycle because we're not ready for recycling. We're not ready to multi-recycle anything. We don't have the licensing. We don't have the end spot even started to be characterized. So the goal should be to multi-recycle and transmute to make your end life easier. But right now, all I can say is stick with it and start getting ready for the future. How do you do that? How do you get ready for the future? My first thing would be to amend the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. Change it so it doesn't say it has to be Yucca Mountain. Change it to be, let's continue looking for new sites as technology improves. The Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board is this lovely government agency that does a review of the Department of Energy's actions with regard to storing nuclear waste. A big part of their reason for existing is to make the public feel better. It's so there's a side-by-side analysis of what they're doing and opinions, and the public can come up and ask them any questions and they'll answer. It's not a secretive society. Consent-based siting. This lovely picture here that you see is from the waste isolation pilot plant in Carlsbad, New Mexico. Now, Yucca Mountain, everyone said no. Carlsbad, the townspeople actually learned about an opportunity and went to the government and said, hi, we would love it if you made a waste site in our community that we can work at. So while the rest of the state of New Mexico is screaming no to nuclear as these casks are being carted down the highway, the people of Carlsbad actually lined the streets and cheered. This is a prime example of how educating the public can work and how consent-based siting can succeed. In doing this, we'll help for recycling facilities as well as repositories. Finally, the DOE actually funds a lot of research projects into the back end of the fuel cycle. I suggest they continue doing that. Try and make it more economically feasible for the market, but also look at funding a pilot plant so that companies don't go in and say, okay, well, we have seen this process work in a lab, but it might not work commercially, and we don't have the money to spend on making sure it will work commercially. We don't want to repeat the history. And then, of course, it would be great if the NRC could resume making their license regulations. All right, and that is all of my research. Thank you. Sarah and then Megan.
Do you think that if consent-based signing continues to yield a stalemate for picking a permanent repository, there's ever a point at which the government can just mandate one? Or do you think that would violate people's rights?
So I wouldn't even look at it as a rights violation issue before that, because think about, I'm going to use this example-wise. Do you have any animal that you really, really hate?
Spiders.
Spiders, okay. Spiders and mosquitoes. So, say your parents walked into your room and went, "Hi, Sarah, I want to have a pet spider." It's going to live in your room. Are you going to leave that spider alone? No, you're going to do everything you can to get rid of it. So at that point you go, yeah, it probably is an infringement on rights to just go in and say, hey, we're going to put this here. But even if they tried to do that, it would not work. And actually Yucca Mountain is a pretty prime example of that, where they went in and they said, look, we're going to use Yucca Mountain. And at some point someone agreed. And then shortly thereafter, everybody disagreed and then started fighting it. And then we ended up at this stalemate. So they could try and mandate, but I really don't think it would work, no.
Can you elaborate more on why proliferation, given our security measures, why proliferation was such a problem? Or maybe it was just fear-mongering? And why today is it perceived as a threat?
Why is proliferation perceived as a threat?
In the U.S.
So it's more of just the ability to access the material, right? So your chemical separations plant, in Purex at least, let's use Purex, right? You're separating out the uranium and the plutonium streams. And their big concern is that some of that would get siphoned off and displaced and nobody would notice. So the concern is that it would be displaced and then someone would come in and use it and, do bad things. Why is it still a concern today? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
So actually, it's because it happens. Like, even with security measures, you can't be perfectly safe. Things happen. So you can look up on the International Atomic Energy Agency website. They actually have a list of all of the proliferation issues they've had in the EU. And I had kind of a fun time with that because I looked it up and went, oh, all right. There are like 5 of them that were found in the Czech Republic. And I thought that was really funny because I lived there for a while. And I was like, woo, we're good spies. Or they're good spies, rather. Not actually a good thing, but I did find it funny. So it's still an issue because it's still possible. It's never going to be impossible if we're separating out the plutonium. But with new recycling technologies, we can keep that together with other things, right? So we can keep it with other minor actinides, or we can just keep it with uranium and not separate it out. It's always going to be a possibility because the technology exists, but then it becomes the question of why would you go after it from a high security recycling facility instead of finding another easier way? So then it's more of a make it not worth their while. So it's still going to be an issue. It's just how do we make it so that it's not going to, like no one's going to want to do it. That's kind of the goal. Okay, well, if anyone has any more questions, I will still be around.
In your research, did you also look at maybe lobbying that's conducted by the oil and gas industry and the coal industry into lobbying their representatives to not necessarily fund a lot of work in nuclear?
I did not, but I'm also not entirely sure I understand your question.
Because nuclear would replace potentially some parts of oil and gas and coal, which are major economic booms for certain states and certain communities.
Okay, you're asking about oil and gas lobbyists saying don't fund nuclear so they don't lose their profits.
Yes.
I did not look into that too much, mostly because I guess it didn't occur to me as a nation we're trying to move away from all the fossil fuels, so it didn't really strike me, no. Okay,
There are one of the challenges.
yeah,
Yes.
all right, thank you.
good morning, everybody. My name, sorry to interrupt any conversations that are going on at the moment, and hello to anybody who's viewing it from online. My name is Ryan Alimento. I'm a rising senior at the University of Southern California, studying for a bachelor's in chemical engineering and a master's in green technologies. And I'm here to talk to you all today about the electric grid and how there are challenges to installing clean energy and interconnecting it to our existing energy grid. So first, let's go over a bit about what the electric grid is and how it's actually organized. So as people who consume electricity are the end users, and we have generation facilities that are creating the electricity. As we've talked about a lot, we have nuclear, coal, natural gas, solar, wind, a bunch of different types of electricity generation. Transmission and distribution, transmission in particular, we can consider almost the interstate of connecting generation to where there is demand. Just like the interstate, if there are too many cars going into the interstate, you experience gridlock. You can't move your cars anywhere, and it takes forever. Similarly, transmission and distribution are kind of a rate limiting factor for how much energy can get to where people want it. Even if a generating facility has, say, 250 megawatts that it can produce, if the transmission architecture can't handle 250, it can only handle 200, the people who want the energy in the end are only going to be able to get 200 megawatts. So let's take a little case study and look at the area around Washington, D.C. Here we have all the different types of generation that feed into DC: wind, hydro, petroleum, natural gas, solar, coal, nuclear, the works. And we have pretty ambitious climate goals: 50% reductions by 2030 and 100% net zero emissions by 2050 under the Biden administration, and hopefully into the future. So looking around the DC area, we want to see what kind of effects that's going to have on the electricity that we're receiving here. So eliminating all of the fossil fuels, we see really the only electricity that's available directly in the Washington area is solar. But like this morning, or during the wintertime, if it's cloudy, then solar is a no-go. You're not creating the amount of electricity that we need for people in the local areas. And that's the importance of transmission, is to, That's the importance of transmission, is to bring distant wind power, which is located only in areas that have enough wind to create the energy needed. Hydro can only exist in large rivers, and nuclear has to have a certain area of safety around metropolitan areas in order to be a viable energy source. So transmission, these lines that you see here, are super, super important in order to bring the electricity to metropolitan areas like Washington, D.C. But that's not the only way that we want to reduce our emissions. In fact, the electric vehicle, transportation is the biggest sector that releases greenhouse gases. Up to 30% of American greenhouse gases are released from tailpipes. Electric vehicles are super important in order to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are being emitted from the biggest chunk of emitters. Electric stoves are super important, moving away from natural gas stoves. Burning natural gas indoors can release harmful pollutants, indoor air pollutants like carbon monoxide. Breathing that in over a long period of time, even in small amounts, is going to cause public health issues. Last but not least, electric heating and cooling. Having electric heat pumps can reduce building and home electricity use by up to 50%. Decreasing the amount of electricity that we need and increasing the amount of renewable energy that we need is critical in order to move away from fossil fuels and start moving towards the renewable transition. But all of this together and other aspects of electrification are going to predictably cause about 3 times as much demand by 2050, meaning that we have a lot more strain on the transmission system, the interstate that is connecting supply and demand. So let's zoom out. We want the entire nation to get involved in this national transition to renewable energies. So here are the 25 most populated cities in the United States. You can see predominantly there on the coasts. Next. And here are fossil fuel resources. Wind potential, almost exclusively, if not only exclusively, only in the Midwest. Solar potential is predominantly in the South. There's some in the Southwest, which is close to a lot of Southern California cities that help comprise or compose a lot of the US population. And then we have hydropower, which mostly in the Pacific Northwest. There's some scattered along the entirety of the eastern seaboard. Putting all together, we get a really, really interesting picture that shows major population centers located very, very far from where renewable energy is going to be in the future. If in 2050 we are 100% relying on renewable energy, that can't all be from one source. It can't all be nuclear, it can't all be solar, it can't all be wind. We are going to have a renewable energy portfolio that takes a little bit of every single one of these resources and connects it to the places where there are people. So that's where transmission comes in at a national level. Being able to bring this energy from the areas such as the Midwest with wind, or any solar availability in the south, bringing it up to the north. An interconnected grid, the ability to transport renewables around freely, is imperative to being able to have a resilient and reliable electric system. Keep going. So, generation for presumably coal, natural gas, other fossil fuels is pretty flexible. You can build a coal plant wherever you want. It's not reliant on how much wind there is. It's not reliant on how much solar there is. It's not reliant on a river turning a turbine. But when we're moving to renewables, we have to build a lot more transmission. We have to have a system to get the energy that we want to the places where it's needed. Up to 2 to 3 times as much transmission is going to be needed by 2050. For context, we have about 600,000 miles of transmission right now, which is more than twice the distance from the Earth to the Moon. And we have to double or triple that in the next 30 years. In the next decade, you're going to have to spend about $300 billion in order to get all of these transmission systems built, provide the services necessary to keep reliable electricity given to the people who need them. Another issue, not economically, but politically and socially arises because we're transporting electricity so far. We're causing interstate commerce, invoking the Interstate Commerce Clause, so now we have federal laws applying to every single transmission grid or transmission system that is spanning a long distance. You're spanning states, you have to follow state laws, state environmental regulations, city environmental regulations, city laws that may or may not be related to the environment. There is a lot of political layers and legal layers that are forming when we're creating infrastructure that is passing through a lot of different jurisdictions. So that leads me to my first recommendation, which is setting a goal. We have climate change goals. We have renewable energy goals. By 2030, we want 50% renewable electricity. By 2050, we want to be completely reliant on renewables. We need a plan for the electric grid. For most of the history of our transmission system and our electric grid, it has been very, very reactive. Upon making a new coal plant or a new natural gas facility, we want to be able to connect that to the grid. So we build a transmission system in response to growth in generation. In order to actually create the kind of resilient grid that we want and interconnection that we want, we need to start being proactive in planning our electric system instead of reactive. The National Renewable Energy Lab, Stanford researchers, Princeton researchers, a number of other universities have studied exactly what kinds of systems we need to build, where we need to build transition, where the key renewable energy generation is going to be existing in the future. And there are very, very well thought out maps for how we can create interconnection between all of the different parts of the grid. Stating that, being aware that this is an issue and that this needs to happen, and acknowledging it officially to create a plan, to create a goal and then a plan to reach that goal is imperative in order to make this happen. We're reaching a point where transmission, because it's been historically so reactive, that it's actually stalling the amount of renewable energy that we're creating. At the top here we see the 1,250 gigawatts of actual generative capacity for the entire United States grid. That is how much electricity we can create. In the queue for interconnection, we have over almost twice that, 2,000 gigawatts of renewables, of wind, solar, nuclear, battery tech. All of this is waiting to be connected to the grid, but is being stalled because creating new transmission takes 5 to 10 plus years in order to get through not only a legal process, but also the actual process of construction. So why is this taking so long? Why is transmission actually barring our ability to create new generation? Because it takes forever? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. Because of the fact that it's crossing so many jurisdictions and invoking so many different laws that are all overlapping. But primarily, it's been pointed at the National Environmental Policy Act. The short answer is permitting. The long answer is a number of different, very nuanced, interconnected legal issues. In NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act has been pointed at as the primary culprit. And there's a reason for that. First, we gotta understand what NEPA is. So NEPA, I like to call it a procedural law, as opposed to more conventional laws that have very strict requirements. It essentially requires federal agencies, before making a large action that would have a significant effect on the human or environment, to study exactly what those effects will be. If multiple agencies are involved, you kind of have a lead agency. Say the Department of Energy wants to issue a permit to a transmission line in order to get it built. That act of issuing the permit needs to be studied, and the transmission line needs to be studied to see how it's going to affect the areas that it's going through, what kinds of water resources are going to be needed for construction, how much emissions are going to be needed. It requires community engagement. It requires discovering and discussing alternatives and the environmental impacts of alternatives. So when you have multiple agencies involved, it's really important because the DOE doesn't have all of the capacity or understanding of, say, forest management. So you go to the Bureau of Land Management, the DOE, a lead agency, the actual agency taking the action, can designate the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, as a collaborating agency. And as a collaborating agency, they would explore the forest impacts that a transmission line would build down a certain route, feed that information to the lead agency, the DOE, and the DOE is actually the agency that makes the NEPA study. But the really unique thing about NEPA, which is interesting but also really frustrating, is that you actually don't need to follow any of the proposals that you have. If you discover an action, if a transmission company or the DOE study discovers an action that would have an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, save endangered species, contribute water to already scarce water resources, literally impossible stuff, they are not required to as long as they're breaking any laws. So they can do the bare minimum to comply with laws, which is okay, it's fine, but the NEPA is not an actual law that enforces an action. It is what I call an umbrella law. Oh, sorry. NEPA is really important, but it has a lot of issues. There's a lot of caveats. And because it's been pointed at as the kind of figurehead for what permitting issues are perceived to be, it was actually included in the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023 at the beginning of June as a compromise between Democrats and Republicans to avoid default. We raised the debt ceiling in part because we included stipulations about setting timelines and page limits on NEPA studies. A 2017 analysis by the Department of Energy, as you guys can see here, 14 environmental impact statements, which are the kind of biggest form of NEPA study that's conducted, had more than 2,000 pages. 6 had longer than 3,600 pages, and the longest one is more than 11,000 pages. And notice that is a solar development project in 6 southwestern states. Transmission projects that are big enough in order to accommodate bringing renewable energy from where it's produced to where it's needed are going to inherently cross multiple states and require a lot of collaboration and a lot of data analysis. But do we need to be looking at NEPA so much? What is the issue with NEPA? Why do we attack it so much? Because it's an umbrella statute. You're not actually requiring an organization to do anything that doesn't comply with other laws. NEPA is just a compilation of understanding of other laws and the kind of effects that alternatives for an action will have. But looking at NEPA is ignoring every other communication issue, other potential issues with laws or regulations shown here. The actual formation of the document is not the problem at stake. There could be a lot of other reasons that these transmission projects are getting stalled, not just because of NEPA, but because of everything that NEPA encompasses. So that leads me to my second recommendation, which is to collect data. The whole point of NEPA, the philosophy of NEPA, is that potential studies, that looking at the potential effects and alternatives, collecting data on that and getting that presented to you will inspire more conscientious action when you're actually carrying out building transmission. The Council on Environmental Quality was made under NEPA in order to regulate how NEPA documents are made. and the regulations that they make are actually mandatory. So in 2020, they made some changes to the regulations to track how much money it takes in order to make these NEPA documents. In the early 2000s, it costs a median of about $2 million, an average of about $5 million to create an environmental impact statement, which adjusted for inflation is about double, if not 2.5 times those. But just this Monday, I believe, they proposed to stop tracking those costs because they felt it would be more better entrusted in the hands of individual agencies and not have a standardized, instead of having a standardized way of tracking costs, they say, no, we're gonna leave it in the hands of the agencies. It takes too long on top of a very already extensive process. In addition to tracking costs, we don't want that to happen, which is a valid argument, but being able to standardize cost tracking, and I argue, go one step further. The Council for Environmental Quality should not only keep tracking costs, not only establish a standardized cost tracking system for NEPA documents throughout the federal government, but also institute timeline tracking. Because in order to actually understand where the roadblocks are within these massive documents, you need to be able to have information about it and analyze data. A 2014 Government Accountability Office study was literally titled "Little Information Exists on NEPA Analyses" because there was so large a dearth of information that exists about how to look at these things. And starting in 2020, that was the first actual tracking of metrics that occurred, and it's proposed to go away. Keep going. And my last recommendation is to improve interagency communication. Not only are there issues with potential individual laws within the broad scope of NEPA, but there's also the issue of actually communicating between agencies and having conversations with local, state, and interagency jurisdictions and whatnot. So the Fiscal Responsibility Act again put $500,000 towards studying the potential use for online and digital technologies to address delays in reviews. $500,000 for a prospective use of very established online communication tech, like a cloud for data storage, or even, I argue, interactive cloud-based NEPA document. NEPA documents inherently have to go get proposed to communities, and then they get sent back with comments. They have to make changes to the document, and they publish it in the Federal Register for more comments. It's a very, very long give and take. Making interactive cloud-based NEPA documents that can be continually accessed by the public, continually commented on, data that can be accessed by every single agency that is involved in the creation of these documents is really, really important to address these communication delays. And putting $500,000 towards it is, frankly, redundant. There already exists programs to do this. This is an example. The interagency NEPA are in permanent collaboration rule. It exists within the FHA. They use it internally, but spending $500,000 to think about the potential of using another program that's separate from what already exists seems redundant. Take this, expand it to the entirety of the federal government, and allow for environmental impact statements in NEPA to no longer be a really, really big issue in causing permanent delays. And the bottom line is that outdating permitting practices, they stifle transmission growth, and not being able to connect new generation, renewable generation to the grid, delays our transition to clean energy as a nation. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
The $500,000 seems kind of cheap based on some of the other numbers we've heard today.
Yes.
Is there any? Did you have any kind of cost analysis if they don't do that? Like, what does it currently cost without anything like that? With any, like, do you have any idea of what? If there's a number associated with that? Because if it saves a bunch of money, is it okay? Is it an okay investment?
Yes, $500,000 compared to billions or millions of dollars does seem pretty sparse, but looking at it as $500,000 is also important. And unfortunately, because of a lack of data collection, it's really difficult to answer that question. If there was more information about it, you could make those kinds of predictions. and make more informed policy. But because there's so little tracking, and even the tracking that does exist is not standardized between agencies. So being able to look at NEPA as a whole, how much time and money does it take to create these documents is virtually impossible. One, because of a lack of standardized data collection, and two, just because there isn't data collection in the first place. So, sorry for not being able to. Yes?
So they started to track NEPA in 2020 and they just ended in 2015.
Yeah.
Is there any data produced from that and costs?
That is a really good question. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that. It would be really interesting to see what kind of information can be processed in a span of 3 years. But yeah, I'm sorry, can't get back to you about that. Yes?
How do you see conducting the study? I mean, would it be NEPA, would it be putting out the RFP, since there's so many different umbrella agencies? Agencies under that big umbrella, what are your recommendations or thoughts about whether it should be maybe a government-led study, or should it be taken out of government and maybe have a data analytic firm or universities do that? Because as someone from an interagency perspective, that are currently looking at biotechnology and the bioeconomy, it's ridiculously crazy to see the number of overlaps between agencies, but also the funding that are going to certain agencies versus others. I mean, as someone from the State Department, we were asked to develop an international plan. And then when you look at all these agencies, they all have little elements of that within their work. Do you see it's better outside of government or within government, especially since allegedly there's not enough data, but there's always data sources out there that can be applied open source data in a different manner than what government could potentially. What are your thoughts on that?
So the $500,000 is not going towards NEPA because NEPA is a law, but rather the Council on Environmental Quality, which is an executive branch office. They could make the individual decision, and I believe it would be more advantageous to use that $500,000 to perhaps hire a consulting firm or go into private industry where there's more capacity for data processing to that level. But the extension of a currently existing program to encompass other federal agencies, that in itself, yes, would require a lot of initial collaboration between agencies in order to consider what kinds of expertise does the DOE have versus the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, versus the DOJ, versus the DOD conducting military exercises, or the Bureau of Land Management, right? It would require a lot of initial collaboration that doesn't already exist, but it would reduce the amount of delays associated with sending a document back and forth continually, or mismatches in procedural agency communication, if that makes sense. If I am one agency and I value clean energy, just part of my agency, like my part of the agency procedures is to value climate change and reducing emissions over perhaps protecting endangered species. If there's a mismatch in communication or mismatch in valuation that is just built into the evaluation of different agencies, then there has to be a way to kind of overcome that hurdle. But yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting issues that need to be addressed when you're actually making a new program in order to accommodate all of that. But there would have to be communication between intra-governmental organizations and potentially outsourcing it to private sector.
So coming up with a determination in terms of references and what they need would probably make sense initially before charging ahead and blowing $500,000.
Exactly, and there are memorandums of understanding that have been explicit to transmission permitting reform that kind of outline more clear definitions, establish more clear deadlines and communicative goals between agencies, but this permitting issue isn't only expansive to or only inclusive of transmission. It also applies to other large projects. Like you saw, a solar document was over 11,000 pages, presumably costed millions of dollars. And acknowledging that and being able to understand that the first step is defining everything and coming up with consensus, and then the second step is actually implementing that. Is really important.
Does going to a fully interconnected national grid increase the risk of large-scale blackouts?
That is a great question. Short answer, no. Long answer, potentially. It depends on how we interconnect it. So, alternating current AC is much more prone to large-scale blackouts because of interconnection. At the moment, we have 3 separate interconnections within the US that operate on the same 60 Hz frequency, but aren't entirely connected by AC. Creating one large continuous AC grid would introduce a lot of stability challenges that, frankly, we aren't equipped to address. Not only are there issues with creating more transmission, but there are also issues with our transmission system as it is being aging, being well past its operational lifetime, and needing the inclusion of stability technologies in order to keep the kind of fluctuations that happen in the AC continue. So AC connections are bad, not bad inherently, but creating one large continuous AC interconnection would introduce those challenges. Connecting the existing interconnections with direct current, which would likely be more expensive because you need to take AC, transform it to direct current, and then transform it back to alternating current. But a direct current interconnection between all of the existing kind of separate micro grids, if that makes sense, would provide more stability than the alternative, just entire AC connection, if that makes sense. Yes?
Since there are a lot of hurdles for permitting and through the NEPA process to get a transmission line up and running, is there like a current, average for how long it takes to get a new transmission online? And then what would like an ideal shortened timeline be with your recommendations to streamline that process?
Great question. To answer your first kind of point, the ideal time would kind of be the same amount of time that it would take for a intrastate project to get approved, which inherently is likely not possible just because a larger project would require more time than a smaller project. Anything less than 5 to 10 years is frankly amazing because it is just taking so long to get these transmission lines built that is creating a massive backlog of renewables. It's no longer financially profitable for a new renewable energy generation facility to enter that queue because you have to continually pay money into keeping your place in line for the potential to get interconnected, but you're waiting on transmission interconnection. It's not profitable for transmission companies because you're spending millions of dollars on considering the environmental effects of your actions. Even though you know you're complying with the laws, it takes so long, your increases the return on investment time almost doubles it. And transmission is extremely lucrative, so decreasing the amount of time that it takes for this kind of pre-filing process to occur and actually getting these built at a faster rate would spur actual individual private industries to not only invest in generation but also transmission. I hope that answered the parts of your question.